Hello, my name's Jake Kerridge, and many thanks to you for joining us. Welcome to the HQ and HQ Digital at the Scene of the Crime 2022 showcase. We're going to take a look at the crime thriller and suspense titles that are coming out from HQ and HQ Digital over the next few months. Now, there are many important aspects of crime thriller fiction, plot and pace, but equally important is, in the words of Kirsty and Phil, location, location, location. Location can be almost a character in itself, turning everyday places or far-flung destinations into scenes of terror. The books I'll be talking about with their authors are great examples of the different ways settings can contribute to crime fiction, from cities to the countryside, exotic islands to claustrophobic homes and communities, as you're about to find out. Our hashtag today is HQ Crime Scene. Do please tag us with your thoughts at HQ Stories. Handles for the authors will be on screen throughout. Let the journey begin. We've all experienced the joyous escapism of being whisked away to far-flung locations through reading, from sun-drenched beaches to bustling cities on the other side of the world. But crime thrillers often delight in turning these globe-trotting adventures into scenes of terror. Our first two authors have done just that with their new books, so sit back, return your tray tables to an upright position, and prepare for takeoff. Well, we kick off with two fine authors, Scott Kershaw and Ross Armstrong. And thanks, guys, for starting us off on this showcase. We're here to talk about your two new jet-setting thrillers, The Game and The Getaway. So let's start with you, Ross. Can you tell us a little bit about The Getaway?
Yeah, The Getaway is the story of Robert Rathwell, a multi-millionaire magnate who escapes to his private island in Greece when he hears of a story brewing back in England that he wants to get away from. And he takes with him his young Scandinavian wife, his lifestyle assistant, the tutor to his young, quite troubled child, and also a man that he's calling a father figure who's simply replied to an ad to be someone the boy can look up to over the summer. And of course, strange setup, and it's not long until things go a little awry in paradise.
Always in trouble, these multi-millionaire magnates.
Yeah. They do get into trouble, don't they? I mean, there's a certain thing about the sort of just stories in the news and the gaps between reality and what we perceive might really be going on that interests me. It's probably one of the things that spark that off, and maybe that's why we're interested in those guys at the moment. The other ones, the ones with the super rich, you know.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And Scott, The Game, it similarly takes us to far-flung territory, but it's a bit different in concept. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so The Game takes 5 seemingly unconnected characters from around the world, and each one has their dearest loved one taken from them, and then they're forced to participate in a game where only one of them will survive, and they have to essentially figure out why they're in it to begin with. Yeah, but in kind of flipping on the head the old death game thing, it's very character driven, trying to figure out why they're there as opposed to what the trap is.
Yeah, so they don't have a clue. Yeah. Yeah, terrific. It's ordinary people going about their ordinary lives and then in an extreme and terrifying situation. I wonder if that was something you wanted to explore. Why is everyday life turning into something terrifying? Why does that work so well in a thriller?
I think everybody likes to be scared to an extent. I think that's why horror films, thrillers, theme parks, I think it's why people drive fast. I think everyone likes to be scared a bit. I think I really try to take a broad variety of characters for it because I just want them to see everyone has a hidden side to them and everyone has something that they're hiding from the past. And I really want to just do that and shake it up a bit with the game. So, yeah, I think that's it. I don't know if that answers it.
And yeah, it would be a compliment if someone said this was as scary as a theme park ride.
Well, yeah, okay, yeah, I guess so.
And Ross, instead of the everyday with your book, we've got a luxurious, exotic holiday destination, something out of the ordinary. Then it turns into a nightmare. And what was appealing to you about using this very beautiful backdrop?
Well, it's particularly, I think there's something about the sort of the glamour and what's beneath the surface that's always interesting with stories like this. I mean, often it's about character and secrets and revelation, and with something like A Private Island in Greece in particular, I mean, the sort of Onassis owned an island off Greece, and all sorts of well-off people have. You know, you got Branson's got the BVI, and you know, it's something about that terrain is both rugged, and there's both something truthful and gritty and dirty underneath, but there's also this absolute gleam and sunshine and this sort of blossoming hope within it too. So you've got the gleaming surface and you've got the grit underneath, really.
I'm glad you mentioned Branson, because we're all thinking it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, yes, I'm looking forward to him suing me. So yeah.
And over the years, we've all been, if we've been traveling, it's mostly been armchair traveling through books or TV, jet setting around the world in the comfort of our own homes. What is it about books, do you think, that works so well in whisking you away, and why does it work particularly well in thrillers? Because they don't always whisk you somewhere you might want to go. What do you think, Scott?
I think, again, it's like everybody likes a taste of danger. Everybody likes a bit of a holiday. Everyone likes reading fantasy books because they take you elsewhere. And for someone like me who's from a very working class background, I set it in places that they're on the surface luxury. So there's characters from New York, characters from Paris, and they're really stereotypical glam places. But I wanted to absolutely tear them down and drag them across the world back to England and really, just show that everybody from those places is still the same. But I think there'll always be an appeal in reading about other places that, especially at the minute in the climate when we don't know if we can actually book a holiday ever. Like every time I've tried to book one, it keeps getting cancelled. So I think at the minute it's the same reason we're doing this interview over camera instead of in person is because in the world at the minute, it's nice to be able to go elsewhere and sit in your armchair. And if you read about people getting messed up and terrified in those areas, then that's even better, right? It's even more fun.
Yeah, I think people will finish the game and feel very glad they're in rainy old England.
Yeah, hopefully,
I agree with what you're saying, Scott. And it's like there's something about like particularly the lockdown gave us an opportunity to sort of dream of going somewhere else. So nothing like being trapped to make you want. And actually, the reading about someone and going there in your mind can be more fulfilling than going to a beautiful place in real life.
Absolutely.
You know, the actuality can be quite disappointing, but I think they're beautiful settings to sort of dream of and desire. You know, and I think there's so much like about reading that's about like pining for another like opportunity or existence or parallel life.
Yeah.
Well, Scott Kershaw, Ross Armstrong, thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers, Rob.
From alleyways to tower blocks, skyscrapers to underpasses, cities provide no shortage of places for nefarious deeds and shady business, making them an ideal setting for our next pair of gripping crime novels. Prepare to see a side of Leeds and London that you definitely wouldn't want to see in real life. And now for something a little closer to home. We're welcomed by Nadine Matheson and John Barlow. Welcome both.
Hi.
You're both authors of city-based crime. So can you tell us a little bit about your forthcoming books? Nadine, let's start with you. Your new novel is called The Binding Room.
It is. It's called The Binding Room, and we're back in Deptford in southeast London. And it starts when popular pastor is murdered, and Henley and her team, they go to the church to investigate, and they find a hidden room, and inside a hidden room is the body of a man. And it turns out that this man may be the first in a chain of ritualistic murders. So that's how The Binding Room starts. And I thought it'd be nice to keep us back in southeast London.
Yes, definitely. And John Barlow, you taking us a bit further north. Can you tell us about To the Grave?
Yeah, so this is a book about a woman who knows that she's going to be murdered, but she can't tell the police. It's set in the world of people trafficking in the north of England, And it's also kind of a twisted love story, all wrapped up in a police procedural.
Twisted love story, the best kind.
Yeah.
So I wonder what drew you both to writing about the particular cities you do write about. Well, let's start with you, John. Leeds is your patch.
Mm. Well, I'm a northerner, so everything I write's about the north. But for this particular book, Leeds was a good option because it's a strange city. It's small but big enough to be cosmopolitan. So it has a lot of rich people in it and a lot of very poor people, often quite close together. And that really fitted in with the plot, where I was bringing those two worlds together in conflict. And I also know the pub very well, you know.
Yes, Nadine, you said you're taking us back to London.
Yeah, I took us back to London, but in particular South East London. So it's an area which I know very well, an area which I grew up and still live in. And similar to John, London, especially South East London, it's very, very diverse, both in the people, in terms of culture. And like my family, we grew up with, my grandmother was a pastor in a church, and there's lots of churches in the South East London area. So that conflict between these little churches tucked away and these new restaurants and stuff sprouting out, it's interesting to see the conflict of those two. So I thought it would be interesting to set a story within that dynamic of a church in that area and seeing how it plays out.
Well, these disputes, I wonder if they often lead to murder, but obviously it does in your book.
It does, yeah. Funny enough, it does lead to murder in my book. That's what makes it interesting.
And both of you, I wonder how important it is to really authentically capture the geography of your cities. I guess if people lived in London or Leeds, would they recognise the locations and the feel of it? Is that what you try to do?
Definitely. I think for me, authenticity is very, very important. So if you pick up the binding rooms and you look at street names, they'll be real street names. So a reader could feel that they could pick up the book and actually jump on a train and get off and actually find that actual location. So I think that level of authenticity, it makes the reader feel much more part of the overall story. And that's what I'm looking for. So it's important for me that they're real.
Yeah. And you, John, yeah.
I was going to add, yeah, I'm sure Nadine's had this as well. When you write about real places, people email you and tweet you saying that they know those places.
Yeah, they do.
And it's really gratifying. My first book in this series, it's set in just south of Leeds, and it's not a very well-known place, but quite a lot of people emailed me and said, I live there. So that's a really gratifying aspect of writing about real places.
It's a nice reaction.
Yeah.
Well, I'm in Peckham right now, so I could go out on a tour with your book, not too far for me, Nadine.
We'll do a tour, Jay.
Yeah. And maybe hop on a train to Leeds.
Yeah,
we'll do the John Barlow tour.
Do a pub crawl, yeah.
I think all our books have pubs.
And in both cases, these are the second books in the series. So we've got D.I. Angelica Henley coming back in your book, Nadine. Yeah. And D.S. Joe Romano is back in yours, John. And is there any difference when you're visiting the characters second time around? Do you know them better, or was it fun to come back to them? Do you feel like you know them now?
It was great, the second book, because the two main characters, I felt that I knew them so well that I could just pop them in a scene and they could just go off on their own. It felt almost like I was just telling the reader what they'd done and I hadn't actually invented any of it. It was a really different kind of writing. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I felt like I was meeting old friends again. Yeah. And I remember sitting down and putting Remuta and Henley together in their first scene together. And I sat back and said, oh, how nice to see you. Because I feel like I've grown to know them the more I write them and the more different situations. Obviously, sometimes distressing situations, but the more situations I put them in, the more I've grown to love them. And I learn more about them as I go along.
Yeah. I mean, my main character is called Joe Romano, and I took that name from a friend of mine. And I was talking to him about it. It struck me that I know the fictional Joe Romano a lot better than the real.
But everyone thinks Henley's based on me, and I'm like, no, it's definitely not. She's definitely not me.
What's the difference?
No, I don't have as much trauma.
As well, it sounds like these characters have been living in your head since you stopped writing the first books, and they're just ready and waiting for you when you start.
Yeah, it feels like that. They've just been like percolating away and just waiting to get back onto the page.
Well, thank you for taking us through the hidden dark byways of London and Leeds. John and Nadine, thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Bye.
It's not just cities that see all the action. Sometimes the most picturesque rural landscapes can prove just as chilling. Whether it's the sense of isolation, exposure to the elements, or the absence of other people around to help, the countryside gives plenty of opportunity for authors to ratchet up the tension, as these next 3 authors show in their new books. Next up, we have Amanda Jennings, Neil Lancaster, and Tina Orr-Munro. Welcome to all of you. And you're going to tell us about your new books. Let's start with you, Amanda. You can tell us about The Haven.
So, The Haven, tells the story of a young couple, Tara and Kit, who meet at university. And also their anarchic, charismatic friend, Jeremy. And when Tara falls pregnant, they all drop out of university, and using Kit's trust fund, they buy this glorious farmhouse down on the wilds of Bodmin Moor, where they set up a commune with a group of others living self-sufficiently off-grid and free from the constraints of society and the things that they're rebelling against. And at first, this idyllic new life is everything they've dreamt of, but obviously as winter draws in, day-to-day life becomes harder and darker and more arduous. And when Jeremy starts to bring vulnerable young women back to the farm, their sort of utopian existence begins to unravel with dark and dramatic consequences.
So not a real utopia, a dystopia. That's what
a dystopia in the end, perhaps.
Well, Neil, can you give us a spoiler-free summing up of The Blood Tide?
Yeah, The Blood Tide is my second in the Max Craigie series. The Blood Tide opens with the disappearance of a fisherman on a remote sea loch up in the west coast of Scotland. It's then followed by the suicide of a young man off the Erskine Bridge in Glasgow. Now, DS Max Craigie begins to realise that these 2 incidents are actually connected, and corruption of a large scale is suspected. So he begins to investigate and soon links it to what appears to be some high-level drug smuggling coming in via the West Coast coastal sea locks. And it is a real tale of betrayal and corruption that goes right to the very, very heart of law enforcement in Scotland. And I can't say much more without giving loads of spoilers.
No. It sounds like you're taking us around the whole country.
Yeah, I tend to do that.
And Tina Orr-Munro, can you tell us about your debut, Breakneck Point?
Yes. So Breakneck Point is the first in the series about a CSI called Ali Diamond. This novel opens with Ali Diamond spectacularly blowing the lid on police corruption, and as a result being unceremoniously dispatched to deepest, darkest Devon, where she stumbles across what she believes to be a serial killer. But unfortunately, because she's has this reputation as being a bit of a whistleblower, none of her police colleagues are willing to listen. And so she has to investigate this person on her own. And as this person gets nearer to home, so the tension and the fear ramps up for Ali Diamond.
Thank you. More police corruption then. I want to ask you, Amanda, The Haven, you're in the sort of space of literary suspense rather than straight crime fiction, I think, this time.
I think, I mean, I don't know if it's definitely not true literary. It's, I suppose it's more, it's not as, I mean, I don't really, I sort of always say that I cling to the crime genre with my bloody fingertips rather than sort of being well wedded in there. My books are obviously, I always think that they're just sort of too dark for straight contemporary fiction, so they sit nicely in the crime genre, but they're not true crime. There aren't any police. This one is very much more, as actually you said after I introduced the book, it's much more looking at sort of how the ideal of a sort of an ideology collapses and that does turn dark, and how human nature comes involved. And there is some blood spilt, obviously. It's one of my books, but it's so I suppose in a way the literary title, I suppose, refers more to the fact that it's very character driven, very place oriented, rather than it being a sort of straightforward crime. My books are usually crimes that have happened in the past and secrets that come sort of in the future, whereas this is much more of a story about things going drastically wrong.
Yes, indeed they do. And Neil, I want to ask you, you served as a military policeman in the RAF, and you were a detective in the Metropolitan Police. And then Tina, you trained as a CSI. So I'm wondering how much, not at all, or a lot, you drew on your own experiences, you two, for writing your books.
Me a great deal. Number of reasons. Obviously, it means I don't have to do a great deal of research. It means I'm quite lazy, so the things I need to know tend to be there for me anyway. So an enormous amount, as much as anything about the characters, because the police is full of characters. It's full of people you wouldn't expect to be police officers and police support staff and CSIs, anybody. So I lean on it to give me elements of characters that I can bring. Ross Fraser, the main one of the sort of the big sidekick, is this enormously bumptious, sweary, crude character. Now, I knew people like that, and many of them in senior ranks. They were very often very good people, but they're enormous fun to write about, and it can give you a real juxtaposition between Max, who's fairly straight, his sidekick Janie, who is again a little awkward and a little but very straight, and then this sort of comedy character almost that has become Ross Fraser. So yeah, I do lean on it. Yes, because of the techniques I've done. I've been on long-term surveillance jobs. I've planted bugs in cars. I've broken into people's houses and put cameras in, all those things. And it helps me make that authentic without drowning the reader in the minutiae of it. But it also allows me to keep the pace up and make people really believe that it's authentic. But, it's still just a story. It's still just a work of fiction.
It's fascinating you draw on the technical know-how and the characters. I wonder if they recognize themselves when they read them.
Oh, dear. That's a worry.
Tina, I see you nodding away.
Yes, very similar to Neil. I've drawn very heavily on my time as a CSI, even though it was quite some time ago. And for me, it is more in the feelings that she experiences when she attends a murder scene, which I did as part of my experience, but also when she attends quite relatively minor crimes like burglaries that would be written off as quite minor, but have this sort of devastating impact on the victims who she interacts with at quite a considerable level. So from my perspective, yes, there were the sort of the practicalities of being a scenes crime officer and what you do at a scene as a scenes crime officer. But in particular for Ali Diamond, when she's called to the murder on the quay, those feelings she experiences are 100% a mirror of my experiences as a scenes crime or CSI, so I think more commonly known now.
Yeah.
See, this is where I find myself doing my whole crime writer imposter syndrome again. For the as always, I'm like, I shouldn't be here.
Now, a question for all of you. We're talking about location here today, and all your novels, these three, are set in rural, isolated settings. So what was it about countryside-based crime that intrigued you and made you want to write about it? And have you visited all the places you've written about in these books?
Do you want to start with me?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not going to be different to most writers, I don't think. But for me, Bodmin Moor was the perfect sort of situation to introduce that idealized. You've already got a romantic notion of sort of, the Yorkshire moors and the Cornish moors, and they're a very evocative setting. But the great thing about that is that you can use the weather and the encroaching winter to add that sense of isolation, which is what happens in my book. So it's very useful if you like to have a setting that reiterates what you're describing narrative wise, I suppose. Cornwall is very close to my heart. It's my mum's homeland. I always say it's it's my mother's land. It's sort of women all the way back go are Cornish, and it's where my heart lies. This is my in her wake fourth. This is my fourth book now set in Cornwall. Cornwall. I did a normally when I'm driving, because my family's down in St Ives, where In Her Wake was based, and a sort of Newlyn, Penzance, where The Storm and The Cliff House were based, that area. So normally I'm racing through Bodmin to get down to where my parents have a house and where we grow up, and that's our land. So for this one, it was brilliant. I went with my best friend. Sadly, she'd just lost her husband and she needed some time away. So we went down for a couple of days walking in Bodmin Moor, and I soaked up that thing that usually I just race through. And this time I was able to really enjoy that Daphne du Maurier country and walk around the moors and soak it all up. So yeah, I do know the settings that I set them in.
Great, thank you. Tina, what about you?
Yes, well, Breakneck Point is set in North Devon. I grew up in North Devon and I returned to live here about 15 years ago. And like Amanda, North Devon is very close to my heart. And I do know the settings, even though I fictionalised them for the purposes of the book, they are all specific places in North Devon. And that whole isolated feel to the setting is just hugely atmospheric. But for me, there was also like a practical element. To set a police crime novel in North Devon, I was able to have a little bit of flexibility because resourcing is a little bit more stretched in rural areas. Geographically, it takes people longer to get to places. And as a senior crime officer, I went to isolated areas, and it was definitely the time I felt the most exposed and the most vulnerable, because invariably the radio wouldn't work and you suddenly felt very much on your own. So it was hugely important, and not just for the kind of the beautiful setting, the atmosphere and the isolation, but also the practical side of having lesser budget, lesser resources, and still trying to police a murder.
Yeah, so a disadvantage for you at work, but an advantage as a writer.
Yes.
And Neil?
Yeah, I mean, I lean on it very heavily. I refer to it when asked as an extra character in the book. I mean, I do write an awful lot of it in the very remote areas, but I do go to the cities as well, because I like the juxtaposition of it. I like the fact that we go from, the most seedy part of Glasgow, and then and then I have them doing long journeys. I enjoy the long journeys they have together. I love them sitting in the car together and then describing the scenery as we go through, and talking about it. I mean, Janie is a city girl, very much so. She hates the countryside, whereas Max is a country boy. He grew up about 5 minutes from where I actually live, because I did that just to make it easy. But I really like the duality of Scotland. I like the fact that I can walk out the door and I can see all the weather, because I live really remotely myself, and I can see it coming. And it's the most beautiful country on earth, as far as I'm concerned. But within it, what feels like a heartbeat, the clouds can come across and it can be raining sideways, or the mist can come down, or the midges can come out. So it was so important for me to reflect that, but then to be able to dive back into the city, which is why I base my books across Scotland. I'm not limited to one city, to one anywhere. I go everywhere, and it makes it such fun. I love it. I love writing about Scotland. It's just terrific.
Brilliant. Well, Neil Lancaster, Tina Orr-Munro, Amanda Jennings, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jake.
Thank you, Jake.
The past few years have seen a huge rise in the popularity of claustrophobic crime thrillers, which trap unsuspecting protagonists in isolated, insular, and often deadly environments with no chance of escape. This is a surefire way to set your heart racing, as our next three authors show by inviting us into a close-knit school community, an isolated house in the middle of nowhere, and a ship halfway across the Atlantic. Come on in, just don't expect to leave anytime soon. Well, now we're delighted to welcome Louise Mumford, Louise Hare, and Helen Monks-Takar. Welcome all. Thanks for joining us. And I think we'll start by asking you to talk a little bit about your new books. Louise Mumford, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about The Safe House?
So The Safe House is about a young woman called Esther. So for 16 years, Esther's mother has told her that the only place that is safe for her is the house. It is remote, it is off the grid, and it is away from the dangers of the outside world. So for 16 years, Esther hasn't spoken to another soul. That all changes when a stranger appears and tells her that Esther's mother's stories of the outside world are false. So Esther has to now work out, is her mother keeping her safe, or keeping her prisoner.
Is the house really the safe house? Yeah, thanks very much. Now, moving from the home to the schoolyard, Helen, can you tell us about such a great passive-aggressive title, this, Such a Good Mother?
I'm glad you noticed. Okay, so Such a Good Mother, down at heel bank clerk and working mum Rose O'Connell finds herself invited into an alpha clique of school mums in the elite school she's managed to get her son into. It starts out as a sort of fish out of water type thriller, but then is it actually a case of the foxes in the chicken coop? My husband describes it as Scarface for mums, which I love.
Terrific. And let's cross the Atlantic and go over to Louise Hare. And can you tell us about Miss Aldridge Regrets?
Yeah, so it's London, 1936. And Lena Aldridge is a struggling nightclub singer. But one night in the club, her boss gets murdered right in front of her. Coincidentally, out of the blue, she's just been offered the chance of a lifetime, which is to travel on the Queen Mary to New York, first class, and have this starring role on Broadway. So the time just seems really perfect until she's on board and one of her fellow passengers dies and she realizes the murderer is actually on board with her.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So we've got 3 claustrophobic settings there. And I wonder, did you deliberately set out to write novels thinking you wanted something as claustrophobic as possible, or did it just come about naturally in the writing process? And what is it about these insular places or communities that makes for such a good setting for crime novels? So what do you think, Louise M?
I think, first of all, I think a lot of people would say that growing up in the 80s in a small Welsh town gives you an insight into insular reclusive places. So I feel like I've drawn on my own childhood quite a bit. I had a brilliant childhood, very happy, just want to make that clear. But I was very sheltered. I didn't get on a plane until I was, in my late 20s, because there didn't have much money. And so I think it was quite easy to get into that mindset. And I think they're pressure cookers, aren't they? Those kind of environments. I think how characters react when you are metaphorically and literally backing them into a corner is always the interesting and exciting thing. And I love epic stories. I love reading about books that span generations and all of that, but I just can't seem to do it in my work. I like to trap my characters and see how they cope.
Yeah, you like to boil down small as possible. Yeah, great. Louise Hare, what about you?
Yeah, so it was kind of an accident. I'd written a short story about a nightclub murder as part of my MA in creative writing. And then when I got my first book deal, I had to sort of pitch an idea, and I sort of ran through a few ideas on my agent. And then as soon as I said, so the murder happens in the club and then she leaves and the end of it is she's going to get on this ship. And she's like, a murder on a ship. Yes, do that. So it was kind of almost got pitched to me to do that. But actually it was just so much fun. And I realized setting it on the Queen Mary, especially because it is the first year of its sort of operation, there are loads of really geeky books that people have written, like people that used to be crew on the ship. So you can find out so much information, loads of pictures, and it was just really exciting to be able to work with those pictures and sort of create those scenes and put my characters into them.
Oh, that's brilliant. So you could get into the period mindset by reading those books. And how about that very insular mindset on a ship where there's a murder and you can't get anywhere? It's terrifying.
Yeah, and there's just so much stuff that goes on ships that you don't realize. It was like these books gave you the insider, about, prostitution and gambling, all those different problems, and all in first class. So I was like, brilliant. This is all.
Yeah, we might have guessed first class. Yeah. And Helen, what about you?
So just echoing what Louise said, I think if you write, well, as I do, sort of commercial thrillers, you need to take your characters to extreme places, and where they're going to have to excavate like the darkest bit of them, put their back against a wall, definitely. And I think in terms of Such a Good Mother, the insularity is definitely the community that's grown up around this very tight catchment area around this new free school. But a lot of the claustrophobia comes from the maternal gaze, not the gaze from mother to child, but the gaze from mother to mother, both in real life and on the streets. And that certainly is a very febrile sort of parameter if you can have a female parameter, for women to do extreme things to each other, which of course they do in my book.
Yes, the opposite of a safe space, I guess, a febrile parameter.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. It's amazing how crime and thrillers proved so good, even though, you know, we call them commercial thrillers, but they're excellent medium for exploring really quite deep and serious issues. Louise Hare, you this book is more of a murder mystery than your debut, This Lovely City, was, but it tackles some of the same serious themes, doesn't it?
Yeah, I obviously I'm mixed race myself, so it's something that I do want to sort of explore, 3 different characters. And I think because when I first started thinking about this book, it was back in 2018, before COVID. And obviously there's a lot of chat about Meghan Markle, and people were saying, you know, not racist because she doesn't look black. And I was quite interested in that aspect of racism as someone who doesn't pass. I was quite interested in how actually passing would change how you sort of presented yourself. So yeah, I was just fascinated by that aspect. And that's, so Lena, my character, is sort of going through this quite traumatic journey, but also having to keep all her own secrets as well as uncover the secrets of someone else, whoever the murderer is.
And Helen, you talked about motherhood, and that's obviously an issue that's in your book too, Louise. It's something that's not as simple as sometimes it's made out to be.
Whoever said it was simple? One of the big themes in mine is that the having it all thing is obviously a con, but we're still buying into it. And I think, you know, just seeing interviews with Stella Creasy and the like recently just makes you so crazy about how little is changing in terms of the working mother's lot, given how hard so many women are working and still think they need to do better and more, which can't be right.
And Louise, the difficulties of mother-daughter relationships.
Well, I mean, even if you have what would be viewed as a great mother-daughter relationship, it's still, as any mother or daughter will tell you, it's still fraught with tension. And that tension is just brilliant for a crime or a thriller book. And of course, well, many would say the main point of being a mother is to keep your child safe, is to protect your child. And of course, that level and that heightened emotion can really switch and kind of go sour quite quickly. And that's what I'm really exploring and I'm not interested in making my mother an out and out villain either in my book. I think the bits I enjoyed writing the most is where I worked out why she got to that point. How did she end up in that house, protecting her daughter so ferociously? You know, what led her to that point, and how did she get there? And that was the really interesting bit.
Well, 3 books that show that you can never quite tell what a safe space really is and how safe it is. But thank you very much, Louise Mumford, Helen Marks-Tackart, Louise Hare. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Some of the best thrillers are those with big concepts at their centre, from buses rigged with speed-sensitive bombs to revived dinosaurs escaping from a theme park. And I think one of our next authors might know a little something about that last one. Coming up with even one blockbuster concept can be tricky to do, but not for our next guests, who have built hugely successful careers out of hooking readers from the get-go. And joining us now are #1 Sunday Times best-selling author Linwood Barclay and one of the most successful screenwriters of all time, and now novelist, David Koepp. We're going to talk today to them about their upcoming thrillers, Aurora by David Koepp, which has been described as epic by no less a person than Linwood Barclay, and also Linwood's Look Both Ways. Thanks both for joining us. So firstly, just tell us a little bit about your books. David, let's start with you and Aurora. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Aurora is a thriller that takes place in the aftermath of a major coronal mass ejection, which is a solar event that occurs quite regularly, but about every 150 years, a solar flare spits out an enormous burst of plasma that hits the Earth. And in this case, we haven't had one in about 150 years. And in this case, it shuts down power for the entire planet for an extended period of time. But I didn't want to write an apocalyptic thriller about how terribly everything goes. Certainly there are problems. But I follow 2 characters, one who has intensely prepared for the possibility of disaster, as some of us have due to events in recent years and our own personalities, and the other who has not prepared in the slightest. And so I tell their stories as they stagger through this extended period of darkness, and their stories overlap and intertwine eventually. Great. Yes, so we're about due another one then. They do occur regularly. The last really powerful one was 1859, and had the planet been wired to an electrical grid, everything would have shut down, and it would shut down for 4 to 18 months. Current estimates are. So obviously that would leave a mark, as they say about
Yes, it'd be inconvenient.
Hugely. Another thing to worry about. Thank you. Well, now Linwood. So elevator pitch is a phrase you're familiar with, the title of one of your books. But can you give us the elevator pitch for Look Both Ways?
Yeah, sure. And let me first just say I was lucky enough to read Aurora in advance, and it's so much fun. I just loved it. Look Both Ways. It's funny. The first time I had actually met David, it seemed apt to make this pitch to what this book Look Both Ways was about. I said, think Jurassic Park, but instead of dinosaurs, it's self-driving cars. and so Look Both Ways is about a Cape Cod-like or a Martha's Vineyard-like place where a big, huge car company that's created, as autonomous vehicles, they want to conduct the ultimate kind of a test of these kinds of cars. And so they persuade everyone for a 1-month test to take all of their conventional automobiles and put them on the mainland, and everybody gets use of one of their self-driving cars for the month, because the best way to test them is if everything on the road is one, because they have kind of like a hive mind. They all talk to each other. They know what all the other cars are doing, and that'd be the perfect way to conduct a test. And it would have been great, except a virus gets introduced into the system and all of the vehicles essentially become homicidal. It'd be like being on an island with 1,000 Christines. And so that is essentially the pitch for Look Both Ways. I mean, I had a lot of fun writing this book, and it's a little, as we may get to, it's kind of different than what I've typically done, because it's more, I would say, it's kind of more like a Michael Crichton thriller instead of the kind of thing I typically write. And so it actually took my publishers a while to figure out what on earth to do with it, and when to bring it out and so forth, because everyone's kind of looking for a certain kind of book for me every year, and this one's a bit different.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm fascinated on how both of you come up with such brilliant concepts, because you've been doing it for so long in the medium of either book or film. And where does your inspiration come from? I want to ask you, Linwood, because you've actually got 2 books out here this year. Take Your Breath Away is published this month, and Look Both Ways, which we've just been talking about, is coming out soon. That's a lot of ideas to conjure up with. So how did the idea for Look Both Ways come about?
That's a really good question. I mean, I guess I've always been I've always loved cars. I'm kind of a car nut. My father was, the magazines, Life, Look, Saturday Evening Post back in the 50s, early 60s. All the car ads that you would have seen were illustrations instead of photography. Right. And my dad drew those cars. That was his job. And he was a commercial illustrator and did these beautifully rendered airbrush drawings of vehicles. So I've always been surrounded by the imagery. So I've always been kind of interested in the whole notion of self-driving cars. And just like I would imagine, like David, we always look at things and think, how could this go horribly wrong? and the cup is always half empty, and so I looked at that. How could this go horribly wrong? And that's when the idea started to come about, what if you had a big, huge press event with the introduction of this vehicle and this test, and just everything went very, very badly.
Fascinating, and sort of carrying on the family tradition for you then.
We can't tell stories about how well it's all going.
Who would care, Who'd be interested in that?
True. David, this concept of the Carrington event is known as knocking out the Earth's power. I mean, how did you find out about this? Were you researching for an idea, or did you just come across it?
I had the idea. It's an idea I'd had for a long time, and I even made a film back in the 90s that also was about a blackout. But because I like a narrow focus and a tight focus on characters or location, that covered only a certain aspect of what a blackout would be. So I wanted to in book form where you can really play out some ideas and do a little more extensive research, I wanted to talk about things on a grander scale. And so I started researching it. And if you Google solar flares history, the first thing that pops up is the Carrington event. It's named after the British astronomer who observed it in 1859. And what fascinated me about it, and then I started reading, and once you go down the Wikipedia rabbit hole, and everyone please donate to Wikipedia, you don't realize how much you use it, but you do. Once I went down the research rabbit hole, it's just fascinating how the extent to which this does occur and the certainty that it will occur again. Now, in 1859, I was fascinated that it was viewed as the sort of a fun distraction. It happened in August. It was summer. The skies lit up with aurora borealis all the way as far north as Colombia from the southern hemisphere, as far south as Jamaica. It was spectacular, and it lasted for days. So people thought it was fun and remarkable, and oh my gosh, look at that. The only thing that was an inconvenience was that telegraph systems, which were the only electrical systems in the world at the time, melted down. A fire spit out of the telegraph boards. The systems were, completely down for 3-4 days, which was a big deal, but not anything that anybody got too worked up about. So I just extrapolated that to today. What I think is interesting about both our books, Linwood, is like anybody, we're very interested in technology, and not just what can go wrong with it, which is quite a bit, but what it's done to us, what our dependence on it is, what our taking it for granted is, how much we've integrated it into our lives, whether we need it or not. And what we think we need is sometimes a lot different from what we do need.
And I would add to that what I think in these two books, the hopes of mine, certainly of yours, is that techno thrillers, or have the elements that have that, are nothing without really good characters and a really good story. And that's what I think is very compelling about Aurora, is you've got these really terrific characters. If you you can do a techie book, but if you haven't got that, you still don't really have, I think, a really top-notch thriller.
It's true. thank you for that. And you take, it's really just, we're looking to science for the premise, and then see what it does to real people, and hopefully real people that we like.
Thanks very much. And a last quick question. I wonder how much you draw on your other professional backgrounds when writing novels. David, you're a screenwriter, you've written Jurassic Park, Spider-Man, and Linwood, you were a journalist for a long time, still are a journalist, and that great word, a humorist, you're described as. How was these previous careers helped with your writing of novels?
Well, for me, I think it was more, not so much subject matter as it is work ethic. When you've worked in newspapers for 3 decades, as I did, writing is a job. It's not waiting for the muse to strike and being all romantic about it. It's you put your ass in the chair and you get to work. And deadlines mean everything. If you work at a newspaper, you can't sort of phone the editor and say, I just wasn't feeling it today. I couldn't do it. That doesn't work. So I treat it, what I have to do is it's going to work. I have a short commute, which is nice, but up the stairs, but I mean, it's a job.
Yeah, I think for me, it was certainly having written a lot of movies and done innumerable rewrites of them. The work ethic thing was there. For me, it was less what I brought than what I discovered. I came to novel writing late. My first book was 2-3 years ago, and this is my second. And within the first 100 pages, I was just delighted at the freedom I had. I didn't realize, but for the first time in 25 years, I could say what someone was thinking or feeling. And you don't necessarily think about it until you try a screenplay, but the only tools you have are what a character says or does, and that's it. And to be able to go inside someone's head and digress for a page or two was just this treat. I found it. And then the other thing I loved was the quiet. Movies take a lot of people to get made. And while certainly any good editor is going to give you a lot of notes, and you give the book to your friends for comments, there's input, but there isn't input in the relentless swarm-like, mode of movies. So I love that sort of singular vision.
Yeah, so you're the boss.
Well, the story's the boss, and you're the assistant storyteller.
A great way of putting it. And thank you so much, guys. David Kep, Linwood Barclay, thank you.
It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Take care.
And so after that whistle-stop worldwide tour, we find ourselves back to reality at our desks. Thank you so much for watching. Do please remember, if you want to share your thoughts on social media, to tag HQ Crime Scene and @HQ Stories. To request blogger copies, the best place to check is HQ's NetGalley page. And for any other requests, you can email bloggerhq@harpercollins.co.uk. If you're press or media, please contact a member of the HQ PR team. I hope you'll enjoy checking out the great books published by HQ and HQ Digital over the next few months. From me, goodbye.